Okay, welcome everybody in this session about V6. It's not a bomb that will drop on you, but it is something that's already there for many years. It's called IPv6. And in some way what we are going to show by the three presenters, Robert, Dave and Benno, about what is the status about IPv6? Is it only a technical problem? Is it also a political problem? How do we solve it, if we can solve it? And even before the meeting, I think there were quite a lot of discussions, no, this is better to do than that is better to do. So it might be quite a lively presentation, or perhaps the questions after it. So first of all, we start with Robert. His background is also security and web environment. He's now working for RIPE, looking after a lot of things like the Atlas testing program. But he's also very interested in the IPv6 environment, and he's going to talk a little bit about what is the status about IPv4, and then further on going to say something about IPv6, the NRENs and its clients. So Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Robert Kistraki. I work for the RIPE-NCC. I'm dealing with R&D there, so somewhat scientific stuff. And those of you who know me and what I do mostly would probably be happy to hear that I'm not going to use the word Atlas in this presentation. Actually, I did already. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to talk about some ramblings, some statistics, and some ideas and some feelings that we have about the consequences of IPv4 runout, which is happening. You will see, and you haven't seen it before, you will see soon, and try to get a feel of what's next and how can we get there and where are we in the big scheme of things. So, in order to figure out where we are in the big scheme of things, if this was the pure RIPE-NCC or RIPE community, I wouldn't even show this graph because everyone would know it by heart anyway. But this is made by our colleague Jeff Houston back at APNIC, and he has been tracking the exhaustion of IPv4 for, I don't know, since 1957 or something. And this is his graph. He actually shows how he believes his model is applicable to the actual runout of IPv4 space. What you can see here is that APNIC, the bluer line, has already hit 0. The RIPE-NCC, the lighter blue line has already hit 0. And the others, Erin and LACNIC, are pretty much hand in hand, will be exhausted very soon. And AFRINIC, the fifth RIR for the African continent, still has some time to go. So this is kind of just to set the stage. These are the exact numbers as of roughly 2 weeks ago. Ever since then, the weeks have been moving a bit back and forth. I think Erin and LACNIC have moved 1 week closer to us. So the expected runout for Erin is somewhere middle of 2014, LACNIC in the summer of 2014. As Jeff usually says, this is actually an interesting thing because the closer the runout date comes, the more uncertain it is going to be, contrary to what people would believe. That's because of runout rushes and so on. But this is like the ballpark number that we can see. You can also see the reserves that the RIRs still have, and the ones that formally ran out, they still have the last /8s, which is something that I'm going to talk about a bit later on. So what happened at the RIPE-NCC in the European region? What we've seen is that the runout was expected, it was seen that it is coming, and it was pretty smooth in terms of we didn't see land runs for rushes for the last bits and pieces, and that's mostly due to the policies that we had in place. As you probably know, the RIPE-NCC is ultimately driven by the policies that are set by the RIPE community, and one of these policies was the so-called run out fairly policy. So before this policy kicked in, if you were a member of the RIPE-NCC and you wanted to have more resources, you had to project a 1-year time frame for your usage of IPv4. With the run out policy, that changed and it shrank to 6 months and then 3 months. So LIRs, or members of the RIPE-NCC, got smaller and smaller chunks, which made it fairer to run out. But at the end of the day, we didn't have any complaints from anyone saying this was absolutely badly handled or something like that. People were accepting the fact that it's out now, so now a new regime is on. The new regime is the last/8 policy. What it really says is that if you're a member of the RIPE-NCC, you can get one in exactly 1/22 space. So to paraphrase Yoda, 1/22 you will get, no more, no less. It doesn't matter if you need more. It doesn't matter if you need less. If you want to have the final bits for you from the RIPE-NCC, that's what you're going to get. In order to get that, you have to be a member of the RIPE-NCC. Well, that's not new, because in order to get resources from the NCC, that has been always the case. You have to have already an IPv6 allocation. So that's kind of a threshold that the community put in order to encourage people to actually deploy IPv6. You still have to provide documentation that you need this address space, so you just cannot turn up and say, by the way, I want it because I'm me and I want it. And more interestingly, there are no PI assignments anymore. So the last/8 is reserved exclusively for members and for them. So there is no such thing as I have a client, I have another client, I have another client, and they all need more address space. They have to be members of the RIPE-NCC in order for this to kick in. So this is what we see in terms of statistics about our own free pool from roughly half a year before the run out. You can see that we have allocated space. It went out, went out, went out. And at this point, which was September last year, we ran out completely, meaning the last/8 policy kicked in. We still have a tiny bit of reserved space. That includes, I think, a /16 for unforeseen allocations, and also a /13 for temporary allocation. So a conference such as this can come to us and say, we need some address space to run the conference, but they have to hand it back once the conference is over. It looks pretty flat, but it is declining. But at the same time, the number of members of the RIPE-NCC is steadily increasing. And that kind of suggests to us, this is roughly the time of the run out, it suggests to us that those who are in dire need of v4 addresses still, they are becoming RIPE-NCC members in order to get the last bits and pieces. But as I said before in the previous slide, that address space is really only meant to be used in IPv6 transition. If you think about it, it's 1,000 addresses, 1,024. It doesn't give you that much of address space if you really want to have clients. One interesting thing on this graph that you might notice is these small dips. This is like March and April every year, where we close off LIRs who didn't pay the year before. So the only thing that you can really see here is that there is a slight increase in terms of the numbers of members, or the speed of getting new members. But that's the rush that we see. It's not really a rush. So okay, consequences. There is no more. Doesn't matter how much you need it, you will not get more because there is no more. Some people talk about the dirtiness at the bottom of the barrel, so the last addresses are probably less useful than the ones that you could have gotten 10 years ago. That might or might not be true. But the point is, if you had your last bit, that is the only bit that you're going to get through the normal procedures. As I said, this is meant to support the transition to IPv6. It's not much to actually give it to clients. It is, as you have seen the graphs before, it is going to be true for the other RIRs as well. So it's not really the case that, okay, the RIPE-NCC in Europe ran out, so we can just go to Africa and get some more, or if they ran out, then we can go to the US and get some more. The policies are in place in all of the RIRs to make it at least difficult to do this. It's not impossible, but for most practical purposes, it doesn't really work well. So everyone is encouraged to switch off on IPv6 because that is really the way to go forward. Of course, there is a chance to get some more address space via other means, most notably transfers. Transfer policies are in place in virtually all of the regions. In the RIPE-NCC regions, these are the three methods that you can do transfer. So you can transfer address space between one member and the other as long as it's PA space, so PI space in this sense cannot be transferred. But you still have to demonstrate need on the receiving end. Otherwise, this transfer is kind of not authorized. You can also transfer address space if you do a merger or an acquisition. So if a company is bought up by some bigger company, then they also inherit the address space. So that's one of the neat ways of doing that. And it is also allowed to do transfers of legacy address space, which many of the NRANs actually hold. So it is not impossible that some arrangements could be made, but at the end of the day, it's only going to last for so much. Interesting to note that these transfers are only allowed within the region. So at the moment, there is no global policy that would allow transfers between regions. The policies are actually different in different regions. So some regions are welcoming address space that enters the region, but never allows address space to leave the region. So if you really want to know more details, then you have to dig up the policies. And this is a small illustration of what we have on our website. This is our transfers page. I really wanted to put this up to illustrate that there is already a huge demand, as you can see, for like almost a /8 worth of address space. And this was 2 weeks ago or so, whereas the supply is a bit lower. This is a public service, so if you go to the RIPE-NCC website, it's relatively easy to find, and you can see how many blocks of which size are actually offered and how many blocks of which size are actually requested. So this is going to be nothing new to you guys. Options for the future, you do NATs, carrier-grade NATs, and we all know that that breaks the end-to-end principle, which is so dear to our heart. It has huge problems with scalability and logging if you have to address LEA requests, who was that user on that particular IP address, and your response is, well, there were 275. That may be your problem. They may say, we don't care about 275, give me who that particular one was, and what is the answer? And obviously, the preferred alternative, at least from our point of view, is to switch on v6, most likely with dual stacking and transition mechanisms for some time. So what do we know about v6 and the state of v6? This is a service that you can go and check out at the RIPE website, where we are tracking the number or the amount of ASNs that are announcing any kind of v6 space. So the proportions here go up to, what's that, 15–20%, really say how many of the ASs within a particular region or country announce v6 space compared to the total number of ASs in that country or region. And what you can see here is that the right region is doing quite well. Relatively speaking, the APNIC region, the Asia-Pacific guys, have been always in the lead in the v6 adoption, and that's no surprise, mostly led by Japan, of course. And we both are well below the globe average, if you will. If you go and check out this site, you can also dynamically ask for countries and regions and political environments and all that, so feel free to go there and check it out. This is a traffic graph from M6. The only reason why I put it up here is to illustrate that their average traffic, which was, when was that, 2 weeks ago or so, was like 2.5 terabits a second, out of which not much is v6, right? But this also illustrates that if we combine this with other statistics, we see that there is actually more v6 traffic out there, but some of it, actually, much of it is not flowing through IXPs. Well, as the example shows, definitely not through M6. And also, it's pretty spiky, you know, so stuff happens all the time. This is a graph from Google when we are focusing on actual users, how many of them are willing or capable to do v6. And it's up and to the right, so that's good news. It has been exponentially increasing, that's also good news. And what I also like is that technologies such as 624 or Teredo is, well, they are going down, which I believe personally is a really, really good news. Funny enough, you probably know why the spikiness is of this graph. The penetration of IPv6 in home networks versus business networks is very, very different, and all these graphs actually show that. Zooming in on Europe, this is also coming directly from Google. They color the countries by the IPv6 penetration or client population, if you will. And for a long, long time, Romania was in the lead because of one Romanian ISP turned on v6 a while ago, 2-3 years ago. But this is shiny and new. Switzerland just took over them by 1%. So they are at the lead with 10% or so adoption. And I think that was because Swisscom started rolling out IPv6. This is a timeline of what you just saw before, this map, but showing just a bunch of countries which I hand-selected. What you can see is this, I think, is Romania, where they turned on V6 in a particular ISP a long time ago. Was that a bit more than a year ago? And they have had a steady V6 penetration ever since. So this is good news. What we can also see here is this is Switzerland. So big ISPs turning on V6 can make a huge difference, and hopefully the example will catch on and others will do as well. Right, so talking about NRENs just a bit to tailor this to the conference. I was just trying to do a naive research, if you will. I wouldn't call it science, but it was just interested in looking into these details. So I took the Terena compendium and I looked through the NRENs listed in there, and I checked how many of them have actual V6 turned on their website. It doesn't mean anything about how much they are really capable of doing that for the clients or for themselves, but it's an indicator about how strongly they believe that V6 is actually something that we need to do. I see no reason why an NREN shouldn't or couldn't turn on V6 on their own website. But apparently, not all of them did, which is fine. And there is a breakdown between GEAN partner countries and other partner countries. And not surprisingly, the other partner countries have a lower penetration of V6. But still, there is work to be done here, I think. Looking at the same compendium a bit more, I was trying to look at how many of the NRENs actually said something about IPv shortage and IPv shortage being a problem. And what I saw was that, well, many of them, almost half of them, say that IPv4 shortage for clients and institutions is a problem that we have. Somewhat less of them actually said that this is affecting new clients. So it makes me wonder, maybe you guys can answer the question, so what about the remaining 25% or 26%? So new clients will not have a problem with V6, V4 run out, but okay, we can see that. And generally, that's an interesting statistics. There is a column that says how much of your V6 address space is allocated to clients, and most of the answers there are floating around 1% or 0.001%, so like minuscule numbers, which is expected for V6. But there are some exceptions, which I will go into a little bit later. And no NREN said that we have IPv6 only clients. Not that it is surprising, but it's a good data point. Some of the comments, and I think this is really stressing the point that I'm trying to make here, they explicitly say that we have no other options but to put our clients behind CGNs or NATs, or the clients themselves want to do this. And that's a somewhat sad story. I would like to see the NRENs as well trying to encourage their clients that there is another option. It's not completely there yet today, but you have to make your move. Otherwise, you will be stuck with these things. And I particularly like the last one. Clients request address spaces larger than are available. Yeah, story of our lives. Okay, IPv6 take-up at the NREN clients. Our colleague Dave was kind enough to pitch a question to the GEANT APM, yeah? Asking these three questions, an estimate of clients with any kind of V6 deployment, you know, whatever they do. And how many of them are actually using V6 as opposed to like, yeah, we heard it, we have an assignment, but not much interested. And if they have assignments or allocations of IPv6 space from outside the NREN, which is also an interesting question. And we had some answers, so I wouldn't call the following slides scientific research, but it's more of a feeling of what we could get from the NRENs themselves. So any kind of V6 deployment. The answers show that many of the NREN clients actually started enabling V6 in one way or another. But most of them are constrained to turning it on the DNS server or the mail server or on the web server. what I found a bit surprising that when I looked into this, some of the countries or clients of NRENs focus on DNS first, and then they turn it on mail, and then they move on to web. Some of them do it the other way around. They actually do mail first, and then they do DNS. Ultimately, it doesn't matter, but I think these are good steps forward. An interesting byproduct of this is that some of the clients here get IPv6 for free, for example, because they moved all the corporate mail to Google Mail, and Google Mail does v6 out of the box. I'm not sure that we could count that as actual v6 take-up, but it's a data point. Okay, about clients who actively use IPv6. Well, it's not easy to categorize what did it mean that clients actually use IPv6. Is that the number of institutions or percentage of institutions? Is that the traffic? How do we measure this? So, with that grain of salt, some of the answers, and actually most of the answers, cluster around the same numbers. So we get answers between 1 and 10%. Sometimes talking about traffic, sometimes talking about percentage of clients who are actually using IPv6. I think it was the Swedish NREN who said, by the way, the same number applies to the eduroam access points as well. So 8 to 10% of them do v6. So if you connect to them, you get v6 right away. And in some cases, it was like, yeah, well, everyone who is connected to us, most of the IPv6 connected clients actually use IPv6. But of course, the proportion of IPv6 connected clients varies from country to country. Finally, assignments from outside the NREN. Well, I thought that this is going to be a very simple question. It turned out not to be a trivial one. Most of the time, the NREN's clients actually get the address space assignments from the NREN themselves. In some cases, however, they argue that, well, what you would give us is a /48 most likely, and that's just not good enough for us because we would like to have a /48 per location or something. So there are cases when the NREN can grant this. There are cases where the NREN doesn't grant this. That depends on how the NREN negotiates with the clients, I guess. A most notable example here is, I think this is in Austria, where the NREN Aconet is a member of the RIPE-NCC, and they got their /30 v6 allocation from the RIPE-NCC, and through their channels, they actually gave out 132, and a bit later a /31 to another client. So this is essentially 75% of their whole address space in v6 terms, which is huge. Luckily, the policies in the RIPE region have been changed since then, so the initial allocation that a member of the RIPE-NCC can get is a /29. So their number for usage was above 80% in 2012 when they submitted this data to the compendium. But ever since then, they have more address space, so they will be fine as well. Okay, some conclusions. v4 addresses are running out globally, so no one is alone if you feel that, oh, I am running out of addresses and I have no way out of this, you are not alone. Everyone has that pain. I heard many people saying that the NRENs are fine, they have all this legacy space, and they have so much to spare that is never going to be a problem for them, at least not for the next 10 years or 20 years. So everyone else will do v6 and the NRENs will not. I think that the numbers prove that that's just not true, both in terms of the NRENs not having address space that they can just spare for the future, but also that they are actually doing v6 take-up. So that's a very good thing. The way forward to actually get out of this situation, I would really like to see that is IPv6, but obviously that has to be complemented with some transition technologies. If push comes to shove, maybe even some NATs, but v6 is the way out on the long run. Which is a good thing because IPv6 take-up in the world is happening, so it's not an educational exercise to, yes, let's just do it, but we will not be able to connect to anyone. There are more and more eyeballs on IPv6, so this is actually going to make a difference. One of the conclusions that I got was that the NRENs generally speaking, are on the same level with IPv6 deployment in terms of their clients actually using IPv6 as the rest of the world. But obviously, that varies from country to country. The problems could be different in different regions. And that's my conclusion. Any questions?
Keihiraki, University of Tokyo. So I agree that IPv4 address is run out, but I don't think that IPv6 is the only solution to that problem. Of course, apart from the NAT or something like that, but because if the problem is IPv4 run out, IPv6 is too complex. So why don't use a much simpler one?
I think I'm not alone to ask the question, what do you think there is that we could use and it's simpler?
Of course, IPv6 is the current only alternative, but there should be many possible alternatives, right? Mm-hmm. If the address run out is a problem, just extend the address region.
Right.
That's a solution.
Right. I had a nice chat with some of the more influential people back in the day, a couple of years ago, and I had a similar question. Like, we would like to see IPv6 taking up. It's not really there, but v4 is running out. So would there be a point in developing IPv5, something in the middle, that extends the address space with some more bits and so on? And there are RFCs that actually propose that, Randy Bush's A+P and so on. But I think that the ultimate answer that I got for there is no point. There is so much investment in this that replacing everything that we did in terms of getting IPv6 up to speed with something completely different may not fly.
But I think that I feel that of course there's already many huge investment, but one of the reasons there is a huge investment is IPv6 is much complex than the IPv4. So if the answer is simpler, the amount of investment in the future should be smaller.
Potentially, and A+P is one of the ways that people proposed. And some people like those ideas, some people don't, but there don't seem to be a universal agreement that that is really the way to go. The only future option seems to be IPv6 at this point in time. That's the way I see it.
Okay.
I agree,
Yeah. Other questions? Over there.
Are you aware of any activities in the NRENs or anything to try to come up with a carrot rather than a stick? Right? I gather in China, for example, you get access to higher bandwidth at lower cost if you use IPv6. Is this possible in Europe, for example, or in the States?
I would certainly like to think that it is possible, but maybe Dave can offer us some insight into that. What we can offer to people to actually go along.
Because
with
financial incentives and encouraging that you get access to more or cheaper or something if you do this, it potentially could be very interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Isn't it true that the key to adopting IPv6 lies with the service providers who have to adopt it in their access networks? Like you gave examples in Romania and Switzerland.
Yeah.
Are you promoting that?
That's a very good question. What we've seen is that the so-called IPv6 day, roughly 2 years ago, and then the IPv6 launch 1 year ago could make a big difference. And I personally believe that the eyeball networks are the ultimate drivers here. It's kind of a chicken and egg problem, right? There is no content on v6, so there is no eyeballs on v6. There is no eyeballs on v6, so why would we do content on v6? And the content providers try to break that by doing the IPv6 day and then the IPv6 launch. I think, as the graphs showed, that the next step is really going to be the eyeball networks. And in that sense, the NRENs contain eyeballs as well as content. So that could make a difference, I think.
Okay, now I want to go to the next one. I think if you have a good one, I think we stay here afterwards also to answer questions. So thanks very much, Robert.
Thank you.
Okay, so we saw what the issues are with IPv4, IPv6, carrots and sticks. Good points, I think. Mani could be one. Dave is from HCANet. He's working with me in our network for the next generation of networks. Sometimes I ask him, should we remove IPv6 from our network? I do it jokingly, by the way, but just to get out the stimulation and see how we can stimulate, get these sticks or these incentives to our clients and other people. So Dave has been working, I think, on IPv6, I don't know how long, but it must be something like 10 or 15 years, perhaps.
12 years.
Or 12, sorry. So he knows a lot about it. He tried a lot of our technology. He knows a lot, but I think HCANet is, and Dave is looking more at how can we stimulate people to utilize it and see that we help the whole world to go to IPv6. So Dave, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you very much, and thank you, Robert. There were some really interesting questions, actually. I'd really like to judge the room. Who here thinks we should support IPv6? That's not unanimous. It's most of the room, but not unanimous. Who thinks we should stop supporting IPv6? 2. That's more than you might expect in this room. That's a grand total of 3 that I saw from here. And that's really interesting because, why not turn it off? As Victor was saying, we've been working on IPv6 in HCANet for a long time. This is the date on which we completed our IPv6 rollout and declared the production. We were working on it for a good 2 years, 2.5 years before that. And any project that has gone on that long and has so little uptake is one where I do feel I have to, despite how much I've been championing it and despite how many times I've been up on this stage and others trying to explain that we really need this and what all the problems are if we don't, we do have to turn around and go, was this actually worthwhile? Maybe it's time to actually go, why are the reasons, and not looking for reasons to turn it off, but what are the reasons to keep going? Are they obvious? I don't think they're obvious anymore because I stopped understanding the problem we're trying to solve. I understand, of course, there's a problem, as Robert was explaining, that there is the good internet and the bad internet. And the good internet is one where everything is open and people can communicate freely and the end-to-end principle rules. And the bad internet is one where people turn this into layers of translation and mediation and competitive advantages, which of course means a disadvantage for someone else. But there are all reasons why the internet should be already on IPv6. They're not reasons that I can say to a customer, let's say someone comes to me, and as Robert says, you can't get PI space in IPv4 anymore. You can't get provider independent space. If a customer comes to me and says, Dave, we have a project, they need access to the internet, they need it through 2 different NRENs, can you help us? I don't know what to say to them anymore. Do I say this? How does that solve their problem? Can anyone tell me how this solves their problem? Give it a shot, please. I'm really sorry to pull the microphone up, but if you would. No, sorry, someone there.
Is this on? Yeah. You could reclaim a lot of space by being more creative with the use of IPv6. For example, in a data center, you could move to having the servers and services on RFC 1918 space, and then use a IPv6 load balancer on the front end. So you're keeping all your content on the back end on IPv4 servers. On the front end, you're presenting that using IPv6 global addresses. That's
a really good answer, and I really appreciate it. In fact, have a HCANet t-shirt for that. That's a really good answer. There's a couple of problems with dealing with that. Thank you very much. And one of them is that when we're trying to deploy something, that works for a specific network with a specific application, and we can't genericize it. And another is, I get the answer or not, it's not exactly what you said, so I don't want to malign what you said, but people say, well, can't we just get v4 space from someone else? There's loads that's wasted. And I did the calculation a while ago. I took Jeff's graphs that Robert showed you, and I projected them out further, and I went, what if we had 2 internets? How long would it take to fill them? And I worked out, it was a few years ago I did this, but the answer was 2019. That's all we buy. If we all give back all our IPv4 space and give it to the new guys, that's how many years we get. So it's not good enough. Another option is NAT 6.4. deploy your network, use IPv4 like you always have been, but then translate it, or use IPv6, I'm sorry, but translate it into IPv4 like we always have been, and get to the internet like that. And that works great for your web browsing sometimes. And then you deploy Skype and it doesn't. It'll probably work in the future. There are ways we can get there. I think it might be our best shot, but it's not solving the problem today. So I have to ask, how did we get here? We've done a lot of very good work on IPv6, so let's look at that. NRENs have done excellent work in deployment, at least in the NREN core and as far as the networks that we control. We've also written and deployed and shared a lot of code because we've run into problems before anyone else because of the sheer scale of what we were doing in the past, and we were able to fix those problems and share the results with the rest of the industry. We're great at promotion. Are we so great at promotion? We do a lot of promotion, but a lot of it seems kind of unfocused, and we sort of call it awareness raising. And I wonder, is there anyone at this point who is unaware of IPv6 who actually wants to do it? And certainly if it happens in a room like this with a session with V6 on the door, everyone walking in the door is aware of V6. I don't know if there's a lot of benefit coming from that. So Robert was kind enough to go through most of the numbers, which means I don't have to, which I'm really grateful for. I will show some. This is from Xeon Statistics, which have kindly allowed me to share, which is a graph of the relative V4 traffic going from Xeon to the NRENs over the past nine or so months. Let's look what happens when we add V6 to this. We get that tiny sliver on top. And that's all. And that's, how long has it been? 10 years that we've had that result. And I picked the direction, by the way, the reason I picked out into the NRENs is that's the direction that makes IPv6 look good. And I don't want to pick on any particular NREN here. Well, I'll pick on one which is my own because our results are even worse. Despite all the work we've been doing, because of the makeup and because, in some ways, small number of statistics, we have these tiny little, slivers of green on top of the blue. And we have to take a look at that. And I think the problem is, it's the old story of being too focused on the technology and not on the product. Now, we've all heard that a million times. Can we get something sensible from this? Well, I'll say that I think, and I am first in line to be faulted here for this, I've been kind of telling two different stories about IPv6. One is, if you don't support IPv6, we'll get that bad internet, and the internet will stagnate, and we won't like the result. And that's all very well, and it's defensible. But when that doesn't work, and when someone says, well, what can I do? I then turn around and go, if we don't support IPv6, you'll be left behind because it's coming anyway. And I don't know how to square these two. Because this one says to me that the transition is fragile and needs everyone's support, and we all have to muck in and get on with it. And this one says that it's coming whether you do anything or not. And the two are kind of conflicting. They're both in some way defensible, but they're both kind of extreme positions, and they're both sort of scaremongering. And I think that these no longer convince anyone who needs to be convinced. The way I see this is that we've become so invested in the success of IPv6. Actually, this quote puts it very well. This is from an editor who was talking about the reactions of authors to getting their books rejected. You can imagine what that's like. And she said, this all becomes clearer why they have these reactions if you think about it with your reader mind instead of your author mind. Authors with books are like mothers with infants. This is good because books, like infants, need someone to unconditionally love them and champion all their causes, but on the other hand, it can be a form of blindness. And I feel like we've been so invested in the success of IPv6 that we've become blind to flaws, not necessarily in the protocol, they're certainly debatable, but as much in the deployment and in our approach. And I'm trying to use my reader mind to think about this. In particular, I'm trying to think of this now as if I'm a person trying to use IPv6 to do their job, what do I need? What can be done? Well, what can we do? This is difficult because we've already kind of done the easy things, and the rest is going to be harder. But I'm going to look at a few areas which are outside our normal areas here. And the first one is one that I pick up from application developers, iOS developers and the like. And that's the idea of the minimum viable product. And I follow a bunch of the Apple blogs, and there's a lot of nonsense in there. But developers talk about this kind of thing. What is that? This is the simplest scanner I have ever found. I think it's fantastic. No one likes scanners. They're awkward and they're big and they're difficult and they're smelly. This one, you take a piece of paper, you put it through it, you mount it as a USB drive, and you have your JPEG, and it is done, and everything else happens in software. The idea of the minimum viable product, it's a very powerful philosophy in software, is you do the smallest thing that will fulfill the thing you're trying to do, and immediately release it, and get it out there. And what you then find out very quickly is the improvements you thought you would have to make it better are probably not the ones that your customers actually want. And probably the way it's going to be used is probably not the way you thought it would be used. Now, that's very, very powerful, and you see it a lot in mobile these days. But it's an anti-IPv6 concept, which is troubling because it's getting so much ground. The minimum viable product is the thing that works on the internet we have today. And the internet we have today is all IPv4, and v6 is only sometimes there. So which one is the developer going to pick? And it gets even worse because the developer is going to stick to their specialization. The developers work through abstractions. And I asked them, I was at a conference about a month ago, and I was going, so this v6 thing, anyone interested? And the answer was very polite and kind and okay, yes, network. What really became clear to me is these guys think of network as utility. These guys think of the network the same way I think of the telcos. I have a thing I need it to do, and it fulfills that spec, thank you very much, I'll go ahead. So the fact that we can't get developers to care about this and to leave their specialization is a problem. It's also something, though, that we can use, because if they're working through an abstraction, that means they're an interface. And that tells us where to focus our efforts. If we focus on make sure that the interface is doing the right thing, then that means we hit a couple of platform owners, not tens or hundreds of thousands of developers. So focus, it turns out, is a very important word. Steve Jobs said this, actually. He said, I'm as proud of the things, when he was asked what he was proud of Apple did, he said, I'm as proud of the things we didn't do as the things that we did. So it's all about, as I see it, the right answer here is to try and find the parts of dissemination where we can make a difference and and where our efforts can actually bear proper fruit, rather than just trying to scattergun as much as possible, because I think the scattergun is no longer effective. We'll come back to this in a bit. That's number one. Number two, disruption. You see this word every day in the tech blogs. Anyone know what disruption theory is? There's another t-shirt in this if anyone wants to answer. Disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation comes from this book, The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. Excellent book. Can't do it justice in the 3 minutes I have here. Well worth reading. And what he was trying to do was work out, why do big, established, well-run firms fail? And he looked to study this at the disk drive industry. Now, why did he study hard disk manufacturers? Well, the answer is he had a friend who was a geneticist, and the friend said, if you want to study genetics, you do not study human beings. Why? Because human beings live too long. There's 60 years between the hands on this photo. If you want to study genetics, you study fruit flies, because they last a day. And you can actually get some meaningful data from that. And the hard disk drive industry is the fruit fly of the technology sector. So that's why I picked them. And he came up with something shocking. He said, if you look at innovations, there's two types of innovations, he said. If you look at what these do over time, and you have some sort of quality on the y-axis, let's be concrete, let's say it's capacity of a hard drive, then you have, say, the 8-inch hard disk. And that had customer demand, which had to fulfill, which was mini computers. They were predominantly used in mini computers, fine. And there were innovations over time which meant that the capacity of an 8-inch hard drive went up and up and up for the same price and the same size and so on. And he says they are sustaining innovations because they are better in every way than what came before them. And then he said, along came the 5.25-inch hard drive. And this was a disruptive innovation because it was worse. Now, why does anyone pay attention to it if it's worse? Well, the answer is the people who were buying hard disks at the time didn't, because they had their needs, which were this red line, and they're being met by this curve of sustaining innovation by the existing manufacturers, which is the white line, which is keeping ahead of their needs. But the 5.25-inch drive came along. All the existing 8-inch drive makers weren't interested. So a bunch of startups were left to find a completely new market for this new type of hard disk, which was personal computers, where suddenly they didn't need all this storage capacity, but they did need something that could fit in the desk inside a bunch of other components. And then something amazing happened, because this disruptive innovation, which started off worse, got its own sustaining innovations and got better. And while it never increased capacity above the 8-inch drive, it suddenly reached a point where it was good enough. And this market just disappears. And this happens in all sorts of industries. It happened to mechanical diggers. It happened to games consoles. The Wii did this to the Xbox and the PlayStation, sold a lot more because it was, even though it was a less powerful system. And I looked at this and I went, can we squeeze this? Can we shoehorn this in some way into to use these lessons for IPv6? And I go, if I relabel these so we have two internets, and we have the set of viable applications that people want to use. General internet usage clearly requires, pretty much the IPv4 internet today, but there's something that could be developed here where we can grow out, and eventually it'll become good enough. I'm sorry, I went too far, thank you. Where suddenly it'll become good enough. And the question is, what is this mysterious application? It only applies if certain conditions hold. I won't go into great detail. I'll concentrate on the second one here. Is it more convenient? Basically means, what can IPv6 do that IPv4 can't? Now, don't panic, because my first technical instinct is it's the same. It's a packet on a wire. It's routed in the same way. I don't mean that. Neither do I mean, like I said earlier, with the abstract, these are the big ideas, why an IPv6 internet would be good. I mean, are there things that a user would want that are actually easier to do on a v6 than v4, even if nothing else currently applies? And there's a few. One colleague mentioned home heater monitors. He says he has a device on his immersion heater in his house, which monitors it and reports back, and he has an app on his mobile phone, and they both communicate with a server. What's the server doing? It's basically being a router. It's only there because of the circumstances. This would actually be easier if they both just use IPv6. There's another one which is really interesting, which is the Gen 6 project has an advanced emergency response network where they go into disaster zones, say there's been an earthquake, and they're trying to use whatever connectivity they can get. They find it easier to use v6 than v4, because it is actually, in that case, much, much easier when you're using whatever you can get your hands on to set up a v6 network rather than a bunch of VPN sessions in v4. And those are the things from which I think we might be able to grow out. Now, the book gives lessons. If we're going to try and work from these, the book gives a couple of lessons on how to start and why incumbents are very bad at this sort of thing. One of them is that you have to work with the forces that prevail and not against. And then there's others like creating new markets. These are things that NRENs, I think, are not very well positioned to do at the best of times. This one, though, we might be able to do something about. That's disruption. But let's get back to the real world. And Robert showed you that there has been some deployment. So let's address that. What actually worked? There's been a lot of really good work in deployment with some measurable effects. The World IPv6 launch had a remarkable effect because it's now the case that if you dual stack your network and your users have a normal usage profile, a double-digit percentage of your traffic will be on IPv6. This is something we couldn't dream of a few years ago. But it's not due to NRENs. It's not really due to academia. It's due to these guys. NRENs did participate, and some of us had some good success here, some of us didn't. But these are the guys who drove it. These are commercials. It seems that the commercial internet is the area that's really pushing adoption now. The task forces, a lot of them, I think, in the national organizations haven't had huge effects on deployment. Some of them have. The Slovenians I want to call out because I was talking with Jan Zorts and he and his colleagues there did some amazing work by fostering a sort of competitive tension between the ISPs who are present. And he said something shocking to me, because he said, what we did is replicatable, but the NREN must not lead it. I went, what? Why? NREN, trusted party, neutral organization, everyone understands them, technically competent. And he said, yes, but the problem is that if the NREN leads it, if someone else leads it and the NREN is there, the NREN is excellent for building credibility. And they must be there in order to maintain that. But if the NREN tries to lead it, then people see academia as just playing with their own toys. His words, not mine. And I know it's not true, and you know it's not true, and he knows it's not true. But if that's the perception from industry, you have to have someone in commercial industry to lead the adoption so that others can follow it. Which leads us back to, at the end, how can we actually contribute? What can we do here? Should we continue to support IPv6? Because my job, I have to go back to my boss, who conveniently is sitting here, and explain to him if we should continue to support IPv6. If not, why not? And if so, how? And I have to take these lessons and try to gather them together. Guys, we have to use IPv4, and we have to use IPv4 solutions. Universities basically are enterprises. They use enterprise solutions. They are enterprise networks. They have enterprise-style customers who need their job done. So we have to keep supporting that. On the other hand, fragmentation really is still a problem. And we can still try to help disrupt the IPv4 network on a larger scale. But like we saw, NRENs aren't brilliantly placed to do that. It's not really like we can spin off companies to seek out new markets. 3 years ago, in Vilnius, in this very session, I stood up and presented this slide. And I said, here's our strands for our strategy. And we were trying to really push the industry. And the problem is NRENs now, I think, just aren't big enough compared to the rest of the internet to push the industry. So this is something we weren't able to push. The other two, on the other hand, we still have to keep a very close eye on IPv4 depletion, find a way for our business to survive that. And we still have to keep supporting our customers and our partners who need IPv6 and who want to deploy it. So here's the three things we get from those three fields. What do we do about these? Well, the one on focus, what can we do with that? My take on this is we need to continue to work where we can make a meaningful contribution, where we can provide training and stuff that we know that someone's actually going to take action on, disseminate where we actually have something to contribute, but stop doing sort of generic awareness raising and generic build it and they will come and we'll hope for the best. I think the time for that has passed. But if we can partner with someone to make an end-to-end product work, let's do that. And of course, we have to plan for IPv4 and to monitor the usage of the remaining addresses and to take the actions we need to in order to handle that. Second one comes from disruption theory. And my take on this is we need to solve the immediate problem first. We always have to concentrate on the customer's actual problem today. That probably involves IPv4. It doesn't always, very usually. Where we develop services around this, it's got to contribute to an end-to-end product. It's got to be something that someone can actually get their hands on day one and grow out from there, because if no one can use it, then there's nothing to grow. And we shouldn't be trying to drag industry. We've got to work with the forces that are there, because there are very strong forces now which are increasing V6 deployment, and we can work with that. And the third is what Jan said to me. It's about building credibility. And this one is really, really simple. Don't regress. We have excellent work done, and we have some remarkable deployments, and there's a lot to learn from for others, and there's a lot for us to build from there. And Don Melton, who was in charge of the Safari project in Apple, said, just do not regress. Whatever your metric is, don't regress, and sheer entropy and dumb luck will mean things will only improve. So I think if we can do this, if we make sure we don't undo and things continue to get better, then we might just pull this off. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Perhaps I'm convinced. I don't know. I would like to hear your reactions by questions or remarks or something like that. So if you have remarks or questions, then.
Thank you for this exciting presentation. My question is, I think if you consider NRENs as a utility provider, then there is no special strategy. I think you just need to follow the leaders and, well, you show the leaders as well. But I think NRENs are more than just utility providers because they create a collaborative environment. And in this respect, I like your slide about this disruptive innovation and looking for applications. So my question here, looking for those applications that will really utilize IPv6 and promote that, do you think that in this discussion how to promote IPv6, all parties that contribute to that application collaborative environment are involved and are aware that they should collaborate in IPv6?
Great question. Let me give you a T-shirt while I think of the answer. And if these are the wrong size, by the way, come back to me. I don't think that the parties, thank you very much, who need to think about, who we need to collaborate to get IPv6 deployment out there are interested in it. I think they're aware of it, but I think they have many things that they're aware of and need to work on. And my thinking is, I see only two ways to go about this. One is from the top down, which is where can we gather everyone together to set the priorities correctly, because of course we'll be able to convince them and set them to work on that sort of thing. And that is an exhausting and very brittle approach. And the other is if one person with an idea and enough money to start up some sort of area where they can look into a new market, can find something which can grow and grow from there. That's the sort that actually seems to work, because what Clayton Christensen showed was there was one disk drive maker who saw a problem coming, and for reasons I won't go into deeply, but we can talk about it over the break if you like, had tremendous difficulty trying to drag his company with him. Now, he's a CEO, you'd think he'd be able to do that, but the whole company was arranged around their existing customers, and it's extraordinarily difficult to change that. So I think the same problem applies here. The people out there who we need to change this have their own priorities, and I don't think we can drag them with that. I think the answer is going to come from someone starting with something small and growing out. I think, and I hope, it's already out there, but it's probably not the ones I mentioned, and I probably don't know what it is yet.
Tim? You want a T-shirt, or I leave that to Dave? Perhaps.
Stick your hand up for a T-shirt. No. I feel like I've just been watching a sort of an Apple presentation. You're stood there all in black with some very fancy slides.
I choose to take that as a compliment.
Well, it is, yes. I'm not quite sure what message. I think you've had a lot of very interesting perspectives, and I think the reader mind thing, I think is a very important thing to take away. And I think we've seen some things here already this week that are pointers to the sort of things we can focus on. I think the 6LoWPAN stuff in particular is very interesting. That's an area where IPv6 can certainly make a difference, home networking. But I fear that all the time, people have always said enterprises are probably going to be the last thing to transition. And I think, and it fits exactly with what you're saying, that if we're trying to force what would naturally perhaps be the last thing to migrate, to be one of the first things, then that's where we've got a problem. So I just wonder whether you think that does fit your model, the sort of problem of the enterprises being perhaps the last things to migrate in many people's minds.
Absolutely, and I'd go so far as to say that I actually start wondering if we're trying to, if we go back to are we solving the wrong problem? I find myself wondering, are we focusing on the things that we see or the things that we're familiar with? There's a lot of stuff about how many addresses are allocated, or how much web browsing, or how much traffic is around IPv6. And I found myself wondering, is that actually the wrong question to ask? Why are we focusing so much on those things? Is there a good reason for it? There might be. I can think of defenses for it. But I can also think of a counter, which is that's just the stuff that we know. And the things we probably need to concentrate on are elsewhere, and are quite possibly still growing. I do, at this point, have the feeling that if you try to take an enterprise which has its own job to do and try to change that job into something which is making the internet better, that's extraordinarily difficult. I just do not know how to do that.
Okay, thanks, Dave. I want to leave it with this, but he will be there. I will listen and hear if his evaluation of go with IPv6 or not, if I have to follow that or not. So, but thanks, Dave, for the interesting view of V6. Thanks. And then we get to the last presentation. It's a little bit about the technical ways how to go from IPv to IPv6. It's by Bernot. He's from Juniper. He has experience in the NREN environment, but also in the enterprise environment. From Dave, we could hear perhaps we shouldn't lead this as NRENs, or perhaps we should better look to the commercial or the enterprises. So, Bernot, I hope that you can enlighten us and help and see if that can push us forward. Thanks, and your time is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction and for the other speaker to have set the stage and help me just to dive a bit in the technology and answer a number of questions that have been asked and throughout this session. I think that's clear that today the level of IP6 traffic in research of education network is not at the level that was expected. You know, if you compare again the investment that has been done so far, you know, is too low. And a number of people, you know, are at risk to lose credibility, and it already happened in commercial networks. You know, I'm thinking about a number of people in Northern Europe, you know, commercial network in Northern Europe, outside of the research community, but that invested in IPv6, you know, as early as 2002, but 10 years later, you know, their management is coming back to them and saying, you know, what have you done? You know, why did you invest in IPv6 and there is not so much traffic so far? So for me, the big inconvenience for any network, but it includes the research community, with this low level of IPv6 traffic, is that, you know, you keep spending your time solving IPv4 problems instead of focusing on the really interesting thing that means putting application on top of a protocol like IPv6 that doesn't bring with it, you know, any problem with address allocation. So stop focusing on v4. And I would like to introduce, you know, throughout of this presentation, a number of technologies that would help dramatically increase the level of user IPv6 traffic. And I would like you to reflect, you know, and understand, you know, what are the root cause in your network of the low level of IPv6 traffic, and trying to understand if those technologies could be applied to your network, so you could just stop, you know, spending valuable resource on fixing IPv4, and finally, you know, investing in the new internet. I was talking recently with one my friend, who is an IT professor in one of the French industry, and he was saying to me, you know, IPv6 is now mainstream. You know, I don't want to take care of it anymore. You know, I have other fish to fry. And when you look at the involvement of the research community in IPv6 since 1990, that's a bit, you know, disappointing. You know, we have seen, you know, the research community, the IETF community doing IPv6, you know, even commercially, you know, as early as 1996, you know, playing with first implementation, creating the 6-bone, you know, working on the 6-bone for 10 years. In the early 2000s, even working with, you know, very high-speed IP6 network. You know, at that time it was OC192, and really deploying the first dual stack networks, you know, having IP6 on very high speed networks. So that would be a bit disappointing not to see the research communities leading the way in the full IP6 adoption. So that's why I like just to try to help, you know, fixing as much as possible, at least proposing some solutions to do that. As mentioned, you know, earlier, you know, if you look at the internet traffic today, you know, it's come from a small number of sources. If you look at the Sunvine report, you know, aside from peer-to-peer networks that is IPv6 enabled today, if you look at the number of HTTP networks, you know, or Netflix or video sharing networks, you see that, you know, the content is there, you know, and so the content is there. It has made available either through native V6 connectivity or through NAT 6.4, but it doesn't really matter. Generally, NAT 6.4 is just a step before we move it to native IPv6. So the content is there. the transit backbone, has been IPv6 enabled for years now. You can trace back facts of IPv6 on very large transit network, at high speed since, I would say, 2002. At the same time, just to help fostering this adoption, generally the peering policy is more liberal for IPv6 than for IPv4. So if you have in your network as a transit provider some V6 capability, you will be able to form a private peering or peering at exchange point much more easily for V6 than for V4. So it helps, really a lot. The drawback is that the actual SLA is not there yet. I looked at the study of a company called Nifo6, and when you look at the actual SLA, you have kind of problems on IPv6 connectivity that are staying for days before being fixed. So that's the unfortunate reality. So what is missing now is the end users, and as Google reports, around 1.2% of the actual internet population is connected through IPv6. I really want just to propose some solution that could dramatically increase that level, that too low level of IPv6 adoption. Clearly, when you look at a network, there is no way you can really drop V4 connectivity. But let's say we are going to offer V4 as a service. Skype, is really a well-known application that doesn't support IPv6 anymore. You can always think about, the application that we don't have the source code anymore. So there is a number of reasons why you should keep IPv4 connectivity. But first of all, the core can be made IPv6 only. And again, a number of service providers, tested it, at relatively large scale, Again, I'm presenting, an NRN here, Cernet2, which has an IPv6 only network, but there is a number of now relatively stable mechanisms like Softwire that are allowing a dynamic IP4 over IPv6 backbone. For sure, when you consider V4 as a service, you remove it from the core, because the core doesn't need to route IPv4, but you start sharing IPv4 addresses. And honestly, that's not new. When you have a gateway at home, you're already sharing an IPv4 address among multiple devices. So we are going just to go one step further, and the duty of the standardization community is to make sure that the solution offered to do this sharing are not, impacting too much the current experience. Because, at home, for example, if you are on an average, you are never using your 64,000 ports of your address. So there is room to further sharing IP4 addresses. I'm really convinced. We have now years of dual stack experience, and especially in the core of National Research Network. And when you look at the option that has been now taken by commercial service providers, based on some experience of IPv4, IPv6 network operation, is that the cost of a dual stack network is prohibitive. You are never going to deploy globally these dual stack networks, because running out of IPv4 networks, IPv4 addresses, you'll need to maintain relatively complex IPv4 backbone, maybe partition in some cases when your network is really big, like Comcast. So you really want to go for a single stack network. So IPv4 is not an option for this single stack network, your only viable option is IPv6. At the same time, you see a movement in the network, in the networks to recoup scattered IP4 address pools. A number of them have been distributed relatively sparsely, and recovering them, you can re-aggregate them if you will. And distributing them from a central point, you maximize their usage, and that's why a number of large service providers are doing, because they have done, relatively stupid, I would say, address allocation for years, and they can't justify more IP4 addresses because their addressing plan was too loose, too many IP4 addresses were lost. So the only way out for them is just to recoup those IP4 addresses, do a number of renumbering, and trying to distribute those IP4 addresses from a central point. And that's what an overlay is about. You are going to have a small number of points of IP4 distribution. I would say IP4 on demand is not new, and IPCP is one of them. DSTM, it's a technology that never, really saw the light, but that has been proposed, a while back, just to exactly do that. You get V6 connectivity, and when you need it, you go through a gateway, and you get your IP4 address for a certain amount of time. And I know, of one of the very large European service providers that had been forced, Juniper and other manufacturers to create IP4 on demand over PPP. So by default, you have IPv6 over PPP all the time, and when the traffic justifies it, you add IPCP, but just on demand. So let me dive into some technology here. I would say the mother of all overlay is what is called DS Lite, dual stack Lite. Again, you get IPv6 all the time. You get a big chunk of IPv6 address, and you receive not only not an entire IPv4 address, but just a number of ports on demand. So you remove the NAT from the CPE, you put it here as a carrier-grade NAT, and that's going to be deployed actually by a number of European service providers. They are going to deploy, in the coming years, this vanilla DS Lite, being prepared to manage logs here, to manage lawful intercept, but dramatically reducing the number of IPv4 addresses they are going to use. Based on that, it was very quickly clear that a carrier-grade NAT in full swing with a full NAT, a simple NAT, inside this carrier would force the carrier to record, such an amount of data that it would not be sustainable. So the idea with, advanced, IPv4 over IPv6 solution is to make, the carrier-grade NAT a simpler NAT. So instead of allocating IP ports on demand, you are going to create blocks of ports per subscribers, or you are going to create deterministic NAT. That means your block of ports is a formula based on your address. So based on that, you can envision, a much more efficient carrier-grade NAT, a much more lawful intercept friendly carrier grade NAT. So the only thing you are doing is passing information about port you are going to use to the CPE. It can be, again, a formula, or it can be a clear start port, end port that you are going to pass through DHCP from your DHCP server to the CPE. So the CPE will know which port to use. And that removes, obviously, any states from the PE, because you know in advance which ports a particular PE is going to use. So I want to present briefly the two options for this mechanism, either a mapping address and ports. So again, you are using a formula. You don't, you just record a formula in the provider edge network, and the rest is just pointing to this formula. So imagine that you have a /41 prefix that you want to assign to your CPE, and each CPE is getting a /53. That gives you 12 bits of addresses, so that you split that in two, and you are assigning 8 bits for your IPv4 address. So you are going to create 4,000 users out of the 256 bits. And each user is going to get around 4,000 ports. You know, that's a decent amount of ports, and that's the way you are using those 12 bits. So you are creating, around 64 subscribers per IPv4 addresses. Another way to do that is to use lightweight 4/6. In that case, you don't have a formula, but you are recording in the provider edge network just a pair of ports, start and stop. And the idea is just to depart from a mathematical formula to increase flexibility. And I would say to keep the model where your configuration is coming from a central DHCP server. Again, in this context, the number of states, the amount of states you are keeping in the provider edge network is relatively low. In my case, I have decided just to assign, a /24 to this lightweight after, and I'm assigning out of this /24 a number of IPv4 addresses. And individually, I can tailor the size of the range I'm assigning to each subscribers. This table is relatively convenient because in the idea of a software-defined network, I can easily load this table from a central location on demand. The good thing about those solutions is they are stateless. This number of states, is not changing all the time, so you can have your CPE called lightweight before, in that case, reach any lightweight after they want to. You are just using any cast to reach the lightweight after, and you can deploy as many lightweight afters you want without, losing states when one of the lightweight after is just going down. So that's really a stateless technology, and that would, help decrease the cost of this of those boxes, because you don't have to do all the logging, all the recording of sessions. They are coming from a formula or from a simple table. So really, the problem with classical DS Lite was that you had to put an extra amount of resource in those provider edge network, making them costly, difficult to deploy. You are losing feature compared to classical NAT in the CPE. With this scenario, you are not losing states when one of the lightweight after is just falling behind. You are just switching to the other lightweight after, which already has the translation ready. Those, lightweight IPv4/6 technologies are, already in a number of commercial products. It has been, recently standardized at the IETF, and at the same time, over the past years, a number of trials got conducted, and we have now, a number of commercial implementation that could be that are now available. So that's really, not just a concept, but something that can be tested on a number of commercial implementation. If now, I looked at what large service providers are doing, again, they are departing from the dual stack model. In 2013, those service providers don't have any enough IPv4 addresses to put, in the access layer of their network. So I blatantly stole some slides from 2 service providers. Those slides have been presented at international conference in the first semester of 2013. So those are really, up-to-date, architecture that the large service provider are going to deploy. So if I look at Orange, for example, they are going to deploy DS Lite. So the CPE are now ready. They have developed, software to have, IPv4 over IPv6 tunneling in their CPE. They worked with manufacturers, including us, to put those provider edge network together, and that will be the way their new edge network will be deployed. No IPv4 in this region of the network. For Dutch Telecom, they are coming with the TerraStream architecture, with an even more simpler architecture, with V6 only, very simple network architecture for the access, just 2 types of routers, and IPv4 is clearly marketed as a service. You have IPv6, big chunk of it, and if you want IPv4, that kind of an on-demand service. You get a chunk of ports, and they are going to use lightweight 4/6. So no more IPv4 address in the network. Just at the peering point, you get IPv4 connectivity because you need it. So I would say, I would expect, I would challenge, the National Research Network just to look at that, for their next generation architectures. Clearly, all those new technologies have an impact on the routers. You need to have, relatively flexible hardware, so you can do NATing, V4 to V6, V6 to V6, V4 to V4. You need to do encapsulation, decapsulation of V6 over V4 and V4 over V6, all of that at line rate. So that's requiring this type of new hardware, we are developing to support those architecture. We know that, the transition mechanism, are evolving quite frequently. So the hardware must adapt now. We can't rely on, to fixed hardware to solve those problems, because, the network, the transition mechanism are using, a mix of NAT, encapsulation, decapsulation, and that seems to be the trend now. To finish, by a note on IPv6 deployment on research and education networks, I think that's really similar to what a number of enterprises are facing. I was talking with Renault car manufacturers. They have garages in China, and here, the quality of the V4 connectivity in China is not good enough, is not ensured in the future. So what they are going to do is they are going to port their spare part application over V6. So it can be available to a number of Chinese garages over the V6 protocol. And we can imagine the same in the field of research of education networks, suddenly you need to connect tens of thousands of schools to the internet. You want to offer good quality internet to the schools. What is your option? Massive carrier grade NAT? I think that's not good enough for schools, for students. What you want to do is to offer them plenty of IP addresses. So the only way to do that is to do that with v6. And when they really need to access an IP4 application, you deploy centrally in the core of your national research network a gateway that is giving connectivity to those remote campuses or schools, but just on demand. Inside the campus, imagine that you have a new building to accommodate a new group in your university that need to get internet connectivity. The idea is inside the campus, you don't want to upgrade, all switches that may not support IPv6 well. You don't want to upgrade, a number of legacy routers. What you are doing, you are offering v6 locally, and when it's needed, you are just tunneling v4 over this v6 infrastructure inside the campus. So you are not bounded by the number of IPv4 addresses that are left in your pool. And with the lightweight 4/6 technologies, what you can do is just you can select the number of ports you are going to assign to a particular building. Here in this building, we have just student PCs. We can assign a small number of ports. Here, we are hosting a server. In this case, we are going to give a full IP4 address to this server in this building. We have full flexibility. And I'm really convinced with this type of architecture, we can, increase dramatically the level of IPv6 traffic. Everybody gets IPv6 by default. So you can take advantage of the traffic offset between v4 and v6 because all the content, all the public content that is already available over v6, about 50%, is instantly switched to it. And for the remaining v4 traffic, you can deploy a small number of gateways to manage it. So in conclusion, I would say that, I really see the commercial internet going to v6 only. The content providers and the modern IP network architectures, they clearly, the service provider clearly can't afford a dual stack network. They are going to move to v6 only networks, and I would encourage, the research and network community to retake the lead and follow those trends, being able to focus on v6 innovation, on applications that they put on v6 instead of concentrating on fixing a number of IP4 shortcomings. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Bino, for this. It's good to see a scenario that you think works and also that has been tested in the environment, in a large environment. So it's good to see that. Questions? There's somewhere there. I don't know if you have Juniper t-shirts.
I have a shirt, sorry.
Hello.
Go on.
I come from a university background rather than an NREN background, so I'm an end site. And one of the problems that we're seeing is not so much with the transport of IPv6, it's actually at the edge. And it's the first top security at the edge and also the accountability. There's a lot more in the security feature sets for IPv4, and the accountability of who had what address is well established, and it just seems to be lacking in IPv6. Are Juniper looking at providing parity between their IPv6 feature sets and their IPv4 feature sets?
Okay, so I take the question. Indeed, there is a need for at least a certain level of parity between V4 features and V6 features. And I've myself worked on this topic of first hop security, and I know that talking with a number of product manager at Juniper that we are doing it. I would like to avoid the problem of low IPv6 adoption being just coming from manufacturers. For sure, the manufacturers are pedaling to make sure V4 and V6 feature are at parity. I would say since as early as 2001. We are not there yet. We still have a number of features to bring at parity between V4 and V6, but I would say that the level of the global level of V6 support on any manufacturers, Juniper or any other, I would say has been demonstrated, good enough to allow relatively large deployment. But I fully agree with you. First hop security is something that we need to keep an eye on to avoid, dropping security level when moving to V6. There are probably a number of workarounds, and maybe I hope we can find innovative solutions to work around it before we have full parity between V4 and V6. But I don't think that should really be an excuse to avoid deploying IPv6.
Okay.
It's not really an excuse for deploying IPv6, but a lot of switching and routing equipment doesn't even provide the ability to have accountability of who had which IPv6 address. You can't get a layer 2, layer 3 binding. You're having to write scripts yourself to raid the neighbor caches from routers so that you know who had which IPv6 address at which time.
I even know some universities that are just dumping all the traffic to one of their servers to provide this function. And I think being in the research environment is probably the best place to do that. Enterprises can't do that. They can't just try to fix the manufacturer flaws to help deploying a technology, but you are in the right spot, I would say, to actually do that, while we are working to bring full parity. I would talk to the enterprise community. I would have a different approach, but you are in the best spot to do that.
Okay, I want to do one last question. I know there was somebody else in the back door, but I hope that you can keep it and ask the person himself. But Tim, can you have one as the last one, and then?
Yeah. So one quick observation. I think I'm concerned about what you suggested there for a university to deploy using that technology. I think that's adding complexity, perhaps unnecessarily. And taking Dave's points on board, so you should be looking for the easy things to do. That's maybe V6ing EduRoam, V6ing your computer science department, making your public-facing services V6 enabled. In answer to Scott's point, I would say there are packages out there that just do that anyway. There's SNMP tools like Nav that do that. My question for you is, and it might be a bit cheeky, the last time I saw you, you had a different vendor badge on, and I'm interested to know, if you feel comfortable in saying it, what differences you maybe perceive in the way that those two companies approach IPv6, whether they have, you would think, or whether you think they have a very closely aligned strategy, whether there's any interesting differences that you don't mind mentioning quickly?
You realize that, I really didn't try to push, the Juniper solution during this session. So I was just mentioning that we are, working on deploying parity between V4 and V6. So I would like just to do a vendor comparison here. I probably like to acknowledge I've been working for two manufacturers that the IPv6 is taken very seriously, and the National Research Network have been for us an extremely good partners to develop new features in the IPv6 environment. So.
Okay, I'll leave it to that. If you want to have more ins and outs on the psychology of people, different things, then please do it afterwards. I want to thank the three speakers, but don't go away. I have a small announcement after that. But thank you very much for all three of you.